Welcome to part 3 of the Bond program. Through this series, we're holding a strong intention to change the expression of the bond in your life, in all our lives, and to create a new space of fairness. And as I've personally witnessed, it can change your life and the lives of those on the planet. So we've talked about our new scientific story. We've talked about seeing differently and why this is so important, moving past linear thinking and noticing the kind of detail and connection that most of us can no longer see. We talked about learning to see in the space between things and how we view the world as something other than a place for just ourselves. We talked about trying to find the whole in every aspect of our daily lives and learning to overcome the us versus them mindset. That's the real purpose of it. How to entertain multiple viewpoints so that you don't automatically take your own side. So our talk today is all about surrendering to wholeness in your relationships. And we want to talk about moving past I, learning to befriend people who aren't just like you, and how a simple change of perspective that focuses on the space between the relationship and not just the individuals will create closer connection and happier relationships in every aspect of our lives. I want to first tell you about a guy called Orland Bishop. Now, Orland Bishop is on a fool's errand. He is working in Watts, California. Now, Watts is the scene of two incredible race riots in the 60s and the 80s that almost resulted in burning the place down to the ground. And now that place of almost irreconcilable differences is now the home to two of the fiercest and most violent gangs in America, the Crips and the Bloods. Bishop is involved in teaching rival gang members how to relate to each other in wholeness. And from his efforts, which are actually successful, we can learn how to live the bond in our relationships, how to surrender to wholeness, because that's exactly what he's teaching them. He's teaching them to relate through an African practice called suobona. Now, most of you might remember this in the movie Avatar, when the Na'vi said to each other, "I see you," and the others would respond, "I see you too." Well, actually, in the African tradition, suobono literally means "we see you," because to an African, seeing is never a solitary act. The individual sees with all of his relatives, all of the deceased, all of his ancestors, all of the people around him, they all see together as one. So when he says suobona, it means we see you. And the response is yabo suobona, which means we see you too. And what Bishop says that really means is the idea that we place ourselves as a vehicle of service to the relationship. And we ask ourselves and take a very different perspective than we do normally. And this change of perspective enables us to connect with people who are not like us. Because most likely you've chosen to connect exclusively with people who are just like you, who share something of you in them. I mean, we like to think of this superficial connection as providing us with a sense of shared identity. And this is what we think of when we think of relationships. You know, we want to be with people who are just like we are, who share our own values, our attitudes, our personalities, even our emotional dispositions. And we tend to conflict with people who are not like us. And so we join groups like the Parent Teachers Association or the Rotary Club, because of a shared passion. And whether that's, a community, a certain kind of game, God, in the case of church, or our children. But our idea of connection in this sense means we're constantly seeking sameness. And of course, what that really means is that the ultimate yardstick by which we judge anybody is our own self. But as we've seen in our first lesson, we're constantly attuned to everybody at every moment. And we can become conscious of it if we pause long enough to listen. But this requires moving beyond a simple clustering of people just like us to find the deeper connection that's always present in any relationship. When we feel the bond, we reduce our sense of us and them, subject and object, I and it, and train ourselves to see I only in relationship to someone else. So that means our focus changes from the self to the vastness of the space in between. So what I'm really talking about here, in a sense, when we're relating to other people, is a kind of contract where you make a contract to the other person to enter the space of pure connection, regardless of any kind of superficial differences. And superficial differences can come in many guises, whether it is our political differences, the differences in our skin, the differences in our background, the differences in our ethnicity or our religion, any kinds of differences. Primarily, though, it's the differences in our beliefs. We find that when people don't believe exactly what we believe, we get very prickly. We decide there's no possibility for connection. That is absolutely not the case. If you use some of the principles that I'm about to tell you, you can connect with anybody, even the people who disagree with everything you stand for. This requires making a few vows with yourself and changing your perspective with someone else. It means you change your view of what a relationship is all about. Because right now, when we think of relationships, invariably, aside from likeness, we also tend to look at what's in it for me. We tend to look at someone else as an it, as an object for our personal gain. Now, this can even be the case in a romantic relationship. Oftentimes, it's an adversarial relationship. It's all about what he's done to me or what she's done to me. And we're constantly at that kind of odds where we are locked into our own self and we're not actually thinking of the relationship first. We're thinking about me, not we. We're thinking about two I's and not a connection, not the bond. And so the first thing we have to do that's essential is to change our perspective, to think of ourselves as a vehicle of service to the connection between yourself and anyone else, no matter how different. And this is exactly what Orland Bishop does with his young men. He brings them out of their neighborhoods, gets them in a retreat setting, and asks them to consider just this question: what do I have to be or do to be of highest service to this other person? What do I have to be or do to enable that other person to flourish? And when you do that, what you're saying basically is that the relationship is more important than either of us. That doesn't mean that you become a victim. It doesn't mean that you submerge all of your wants and needs, but it says that you put the relationship first. And when you do that, you realize that it's the connection that really counts. You open yourself as a vehicle of connection. The second thing you do that he suggests to these young men is to open yourself to the highest good in the person, no matter what their past is, no matter how adversarial you've been in the past. Within everyone, there is a higher good. Now, of course, we're not talking about people who physically abuse you or emotionally abuse you. I'm not talking about toxic relationships. But I'm talking about most relationships where we're so busy seeing the flaws that we forget the highest good in the person, which everyone has, which can be so easily stoked. The other thing that is so important is when you speak, in every way, to share your deepest aspects of yourself, to share your real truth. And that real truth is not really your beliefs, because your beliefs are ephemeral. It's about what you're feeling. It's about what you're experiencing at that moment. It's what your perception of a situation is. And when you share, instead of enforcing what's right, what's the only way of seeing things, when you share these deepest aspects of yourself, rather than engaging in superficial chit-chat, and when you encourage other people to do the same, absolute magic happens. On our teleclass and our Fairness Summit, we have a number of thought leaders who have talked about the power of deep truthfulness, and it cannot be overemphasized. It's usually the thing that people don't do. What they do when they get angry with each other is just be angry. They don't talk about why they're angry. They don't talk about the fear that usually happens behind it. If someone's late, there's usually a fear that something happened to them. That's behind the irritation and the anger, is a fear. And when you talk about that, when you talk about something truthful like that, you make that connection. When you're meeting someone who is not like you, and you share something really deep about yourself, your highest truth, your deepest value system, there is something in that that creates and finds a connection, no matter how different that person is, because underneath those superficial differences, what you're really connecting with is human emotion, human feelings, human values, and those tend to be universal. And so by sharing, you make that deeper connection that lies beneath any kind of superficial belief. The other thing that is so important is an incredible, almost cosmic desire to listen actively with your heart, mind, and soul. That is also magic. It also is an elixir to other people, because so often, in fact, most of the time, we're not heard. We're not listened to. And even by our loved ones, we're never listened to, not deeply, not wholly. So vow, particularly with the people who are not like you, to listen deeply, to listen with your soul. We talked in part 2 about noticing body language. Well, that's also part of listening, seeing every aspect of another person and finding out what they're really saying. So vow to give them genuine, heartfelt, soul-inspired listening. The other thing to watch for is judgment. We've talked about this earlier in this series too. Catch yourself when you're judging someone else, and examine your emotions when you do. What is going on in me that I'm making this judgment? And I mean, look at your body. What's happening there? Are you feeling heat? Are you feeling anger rising up in you? Take a moment to find out why you're judging. What is behind that emotion? Why is it making you so angry? Why is it making you ridicule something? What's the emotion behind it? After you do this for a while, after you observe and stop judgment, after you listen actively, after you share so deeply, then watch what happens and how a different perception of humanity develops when you and the others share this deeply. It is magic. A new kind of meaning, a new kind of connection comes into being. Many thought leaders, and I've noticed this myself too, when people share deeply in my intention workshops, I find that in 2 minutes, they are soulmates. By making a connection, making a vow and a commitment to carrying out intention together as a group to someone with a healing crisis, they quickly become deeply, deeply connected, no matter what their background, no matter what their differences, no matter what any superficial divides. The other thing that's really important is to let go of the idea that you're right. That is so central to any kind of connection, particularly with people who are not like you. It's okay to allow different realities to coexist, again, without judgment. This is so difficult for us to take on board because we cannot believe that more than one reality exists. But as we've seen on this teleclass, it's very easy for different realities to exist. In fact, they almost always do. Each of us has a slightly different take on what has happened in our lives and in connected lives. Each of us is going to come with a different version of the truth. And so to connect with anyone, you have to let go of the possibility that only one version of reality exists. And the other thing that's really important is to understand that differences are an opportunity. They're an opportunity to, kick around new ideas creatively for greater possibility between you. And that's always the interesting thing. When you look at differences as a chance to blue sky another way, then you let go of your attachment to being right all the time and getting your own way. Look at somebody's different point of view as a way you can kick around something, a way you can learn something more. So those are some of the rules of engagement. But the other thing that is so essential about what Orland Bishop does in teaching his young people is to use the rules of dialogue. Now, he took his lead from a thing called Bohmian dialogue, which I write about in The Bond. And Bohmian dialogue was invented by a physicist called David Bohm. He believed that the way we speak with each other is flawed in the West because, once again, we think that our way is the only way. We think our version of reality is the only truth. And he felt that individual versions of reality are built up just by layer upon layer of belief system. And our beliefs, of course, are culturally induced. We believe what our history has taught us to believe. We believe what we hear through our culture, but there's no necessarily perfect truth in any of that. And so we get to a position where we disagree with anyone who in any way strays from our beliefs. And that is the cause of an incredible conflict. And he felt if people could only learn to speak with each other a different way, that there would be much more harmony in the world, but also there would be greater connection. So what he basically said is that if you use a communication in an unstructured way, it's going to create deeper understanding, deeper connection, and most importantly, a new synergy of ideas. A greater mind, as he put it, comes into being. He felt that if we try to talk together about subjects that matter most to us, when we speak from our own version of the truth, we invariably end up disagreeing, particularly because we feel we have to win a debate. So he wanted to slow down the process of thoughts we have so that individual and collective presuppositions could be explored and the ideas and beliefs and feelings beyond them exposed. So in Bohmian dialogue, he proposed a method of discourse that would slow down the process of thoughts so that individual and collective presuppositions could be explored and the ideas and beliefs and feelings behind them exposed. And by helping people to understand the processes that interfere with real communication, he felt this kind of exchange would establish a common version of reality, and he thought of dialogue a little bit like a river flowing around and through the participants, and it would reinforce the bond between them and create what he called this coherent culture of shared meaning. Another thing that Bohmian dialogue does is it gives us a sense of ourselves as part of a bigger whole. And once we begin to have that view, we begin to act differently toward each other. By removing a self-serving aim from the relationship, we can stop fighting nature. We stop fighting this will to wholeness, and we surrender to our natural impulse toward connection. And when we feel that connected, we can easily embrace difference. So when you're working either with one other person or in a group, and especially when you're discussing something with someone who doesn't agree with you, a really great way of going about it is observing these kinds of rules of dialogue. Now, we're going to be talking about dialogue with many other thought leaders on our call, but here are some of the basic rules. The first and most important idea is discuss, don't debate. Remember, the purpose is not to reach a decision or to have a debate, but to share deeply. And the next idea is to avoid monologuing. How often does this happen? Make sure to take turns speaking. Give other people a turn and check yourself if you're speaking more than a few minutes at a time. Also, give the rest of the group, if it's a group, time to speak. And be mindful if someone hasn't had a turn. When other people are speaking, be alert to your own emotional reactions, particularly to those whose views differ from yours. As we said before, one of the key elements here is deep truth-telling. Engage in telling your real truth. What does it really mean to you? What is the most important thing you have? What have you dreamt for? What do you value most? Tell them what matters to you in your community, in your life, with your relationships, in your country, in the world. Always be fully present. And that means just shutting off that constant stream of thinking that goes on and just being present with your senses, with your mind, with heart, mind, and soul. And if you do start thinking, particularly about what you're going to say next, check yourself. You can do this with a little press to your palm, just to remind yourselves to stop. And remember, most importantly, no matter how different someone's worldview is from yours, don't judge. Now, this might sound like pie-in-the-sky utopian thinking, but dialoguing and Bohemian dialogue and a number of kinds of dialogue have been used all over the world for peacemaking, for resolving conflict, for healing huge differences. It was used, for instance, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I talk about this in my book, The Bond. One of the most contentious issues in America today, abortion. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, a number of employees at the Planned Parenthood clinic there got shot when an anti-abortionist came in with a gun. After that happened, leaders of both sides of the debate, the pro-life and pro-choice leaders, both decided it was really important that they get together. But when they did, they decided to engage in dialogue. And they had never done this before. They had been involved in great name-calling, belittling, bad press about each other. They really couldn't even be in the same room together. But they set up a system of meeting in secret for years. And they decided to go by certain rules, that they would tone down their inflammatory language, that they wouldn't even announce what side of the debate they stood on until they had shared deeply about what they believed. And they did this, and they followed these kinds of rules, and they talked about why, what led them to believe what they believe. And what happened after a while was extraordinary. When there were more threats to some of the other abortion clinics, it was the pro-life people who alerted the pro-choice people and let them know that people were in danger or violence was going to occur. When there were some people who wanted to foment violence, who wanted to come to Massachusetts, the two sides stood shoulder to shoulder to say they weren't welcome. They began searching for creative ways they could work together on issues that meant a great deal to both sides, like teenage pregnancies. And at the end of these number of years of meeting in secret, they held a press conference. And when they did, one of the reporters said to them, "So, who won? Who won the debate?" And both sides answered, "Well, no one. We just shared very deeply, and after sharing deeply our own value systems, we actually believe more firmly what we believed before." So the reporter said to them, "So it was a failure then?" And they said, "Oh no, now we go out together, we party together, we watch each other's children, we love each other." And so their beliefs stayed the same, but they found the bond. And that can occur, that kind of connection can occur even when huge worldviews collide. Now, these sorts of ideas and dialogue itself can also be used for forgiveness. In my book, The Bond, I talk about wrongdoing as being like a knot. The perpetrator has stolen power from the victim, and the victim has had impotence thrust upon him. And so an imbalance gets set up, and it doesn't get sorted by justice. Let's say the perpetrator is punished. Let's say someone has stolen something from you, and the perpetrator is punished. He's put in jail. Well, that doesn't give you back your television set that got stolen. And it also doesn't force the perpetrator to really face what he or she has done. It doesn't show, why he did it either. It doesn't reveal what's going on in him. So one of the ways that many conflict resolution experts are now dealing with forgiveness is all about shifting away from who is right and who is wrong to who is wounded and how to heal them. And that works greatly through deep truth-telling. It's a particular kind of dialogue technique that a number of our thought leaders will be addressing on our Fairness Summit. I found an extraordinary example of this in a story of a healing dialogue that occurred between a former member of the Nazi youth, the Hitler Youth Movement, that was Gottfried Lieb, and the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, Mary Rothschild. They were sitting together in this healing dialogue group, and they were instructed to speak to each other deeply and truthfully. Now, this didn't have to be pretty. It didn't have to be without confrontation, but here's how it went. Mary turned to Gottfried and she said, "So what was your involvement in the Holocaust? Did you get really involved?" And he said, "Well, I beat up a few Jews, I smashed some windows, but I was only 16. He was doing what most of us do. He was trying to wriggle out of his culpability, and he was basically giving an excuse." Well, this did not wash with her. So she turns to him and she says, "Okay, so suppose it had been 10 years later and you were 10 years older. Would you have sent my relatives to the gas chamber?" And he spent a great deal of time before responding. And what he said was extraordinary. He turned to her and he said, "I just don't know." At that moment, something magic released inside her. It was like a justification, an acknowledgement that she didn't even know she was seeking. He had just revealed his soul to her. He had basically said, I could have been a mass murderer. He had opened himself to a level of vulnerability and truth that put them on an equal plane. She realized his pain was as much as hers, because he was the one who was weeping then. And he said, I'm in the dungeon of history. I was a Nazi. My children are Nazis. My grandchildren are Nazis. I will always be associated with this. I am in the abyss. To which she replied, she went over and she she took his hand and she looked him straight in the eye and she said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Thou. Suddenly she was basically saying to him, we're not Nazi and Jew anymore. It's over. We are one. With his deep and truthful admission, the connection between them got reestablished. The knot got untied. They were able to move forward with their business. And this is the extraordinary power of deep truth and deep truth-telling. Even with someone who has harmed you and wronged you beyond belief. So I'm going to suggest that you take 2 exercises out into your world and try them out. The first thing I'd like you to do is to find someone who totally disagrees with something you believe in. Anything. Abortion, gun control, the war in Iraq, Republicanism versus Democrats. You name it. Choose something. How to fix the problems that we have right now. Choose something and sit down and have a dialogue about it. And make the vow that you will not have a debate. It's not about you winning anything. You're not going to win your arguments over. That's not what you want to do. You don't want to score points. And try that out. And try that exercise and see what happens. If you don't have a debate and you go through those rules of dialogue, remember, don't reach a decision, take turns speaking, be alert to your own reactions, use deep truth-telling, be fully present and listen with heart and mind, and don't judge. Use those rules of engagement and see what happens. And remember, too, your job is to put yourself as a vehicle of service to the relationship, where you're open to the highest good in that person, and you listen deeply. Besides sharing, you listen deeply to what that person truly believes, to their true values, their core values, underneath any deep differences, and see what happens. And see what happens to you in your feelings about their different reality from yours. Can you allow it to coexist a bit more with yourself? And also look for something else. Look for whether or not you can engage differences creatively for greater possibility. And see what happens. Now, the next exercise I want you to try is with someone who has hurt you deeply, or whom you have hurt deeply. A really good exercise, if you don't have someone who has hurt you or whom you have hurt, who's still in your circle of friends or loved ones, is to role play with a dear person, a dear friend, a dear relationship. Think of the worst thing you've ever done or the worst thing that has ever been done to you. Now sit with that person, and that person will play the other party, the wronged party or the wrongdoer. And turn to that person, and I'd like you to say exactly what you really want to say to them. But I want you to remember these rules of engagement, to listen deeply, not to win. It's not about convincing them that they were wrong and you were right. It's about what your feelings were in that situation and just sharing your feelings. And I'd like the other person to then role play the feelings of the other party and see what comes up. I do this in my workshops, and it's incredibly healing. We see what goes on between the person who is playing the role to which this actually happened and the power of the other person in role play, because what ends up happening most of the time is some sort of releasing. The person talking about the wrongdoing that he or she was really involved with gets to see it from an aerial perspective, gets to understand a little bit more about what the other person thought about. And it really gives him or her 360-degree vision. So try this and see what happens. Now, a lot of people wonder how we can have compassion for people that we don't know. You know, how we can develop more compassion for the people we don't know or even the people we don't like. Well, there's a very simple way to do this. It's called non-specific compassion, and it's actually a very ancient practice. It's been practiced by Buddhists, and it's a progressive meditation that you can carry out every day. Now, the modern twist to this is very interesting because, the modern twist to this is very interesting because it's been studied by scientists at the University of Wisconsin. And what they found is that even novice meditators who try this quickly develop compassion for everybody. So this is the way to open your heart to the universe. And it's a simple practice, and it happens over just a few weeks. You start feeling compassion for everyone. And here's how it starts. You think to yourself, get into a meditative state, and if you've never... So this is how it works. Get into a meditative state, and if you've never done that before, just try it like this. You take a deep inhale and exhale. Deep inhale and exhale. And then, after a few moments of this, of inhaling and exhaling, you imagine one of your great loved ones, the closest person in your life, and you send him or her the following intention. I appreciate the kindnesses and love of all living creatures. May they be well and free from suffering. So think of your loved one and hold that thought. I appreciate the kindnesses and love of all living creatures. May they be well and free from suffering. And then you make this progressive. After you've tried this for a few days, then start with your loved one and then move on to your friends and send that to them. And the rest of your family, and send that compassionate meditation to them. I appreciate the kindnesses and love of all living creatures. May they be well and free from suffering. And then, when you've sent that to your friends and your loved ones, start sending it to your acquaintances after you've practiced it a few more days. I appreciate the kindnesses and love of all living creatures. May they be well and free from suffering. So you first think of your loved ones, then your friends, then your acquaintances, and finally, after a few more days, when you send that compassionate meditation, I appreciate the kindnesses and love of all living creatures. May they be well and free from suffering. You start out with your loved ones, then your friends, then your acquaintances, and also your enemies. And you send that out. Every day you take a minute to send out that little thought in a meditative state, and within 2 or 3 weeks, you will be much more sensitized to everyone with whom you come into contact. I find this also happens when we do group intention. As you know, I do group intention experiments, and I also train people in healing intention in small groups. And I find that very quickly, people who have engaged in this kind of philanthropic intention become sensitized and connected to people far more than they were before. And I mean everyone. They feel connected to strangers. Now, there's a good reason for this effect. And it's a really fascinating effect that occurred after I started doing my giant intention experiments. As you may or may not know, at this recording, I've run 23 intention experiments. What I do is I work with my scientists that I know, and I've worked with many from the University of Arizona, University of California, Penn State University, and universities in Germany and in Russia. And I ask them to set up a target of some sort. We've done ones on seeds. We've done some trying to make plants grow faster, on water, trying to purify water in many ways. We've done experiments on looking at changing water pH, and we've done experiments on lowering violence, a very provocative experiment several years ago. And of our 23 experiments, 18 have shown positive results. So what's been really fascinating, particularly with our peace intention experiment, is the palpable sense of oneness people feel. Now, several years ago, I set up this experiment to send intention to war-torn Sri Lanka. And I had people from, I think it was 60, 70 countries around the globe, thousands of people involved with this. We sent intention for 20 minutes. We had a 20-minute window with intention sent for just 10 minutes every day for 8 days. And I had a team of scientists monitoring what had happened for 2 years before and what happened for several months afterward. And it was remarkable what happened. Although initially killings went up, death rates fell by 74%, injury rates fell by 48%. And looking at this with statistical methods over timelines, we found extraordinary things, that what should have happened in terms of violence did not happen, and the violence went down against all predictions. Another thing that happened was amazing. During our week, it seemed to be a pivotal week in changing the course of a 25-year war. Before that, the Tamil Tiger rebels had been in charge and had essentially controlled the war and had controlled the north of the country. And after that very week, the government won a number of decisive battles during our week, and within 3 months had recaptured the north, and a few months later, this 25-year war was over. Now, I don't know whether we did it. One study does not make a science. You know, it's provocative. We want to run it again. We want to run peace intention experiments a number of times. And after we have, when you run it 4, 5, 6 times, you start getting something interesting if the same thing happens. But there was another thing that happened too that was even more extraordinary. And that was what happened to my participants. Because I have been surveying the people who get involved with our intention experiments, and they come from 90 countries around the world. And what happens is, even though the experiment is conducted in a laboratory, usually at the University of Arizona, I have people from all over the world who come onto my website and participate together in sending the same intention to that target. And what they report is an extraordinary, palpable sense of oneness that is just incredible. Sometimes the feeling of oneness is so powerful that we have to move away from our computers, or if we're running it on the telephone with a teleseminar, we have to move away. And besides feeling this palpable sense of oneness, another thing that they reported is a massive change in their feeling toward other people. They reported on surveys feeling closer to everyone in their family, all of their relations and friends. But the most extraordinary change was how they felt with strangers. They felt closer to every stranger with whom they came in contact. And so I think that there is something that's supercharging about sending an intention for philanthropic good. There's something about giving that's so powerful, it changes us forever, and particularly in that kind of group setting. Now, very much by accident, I began creating small group intention settings too. One of the people who is part of my community, Don Berry, wrote to us several years ago to say, I have ankylosing spondylitis. I can't move my spine. So I'll be an intention experiment because I have so many medical reports that any change will be noted by my doctors. So I thought, that's interesting. Let's put his name on our website and let the readers, and in our community, and see what the readers want to do. Now, spontaneously, they started collecting together and sending Don intention. And here's what happened. He had been in terrible pain. And a few months after this, he wrote me and said, my pain is way down. And then a few months after that, he wrote me and said, my pain is gone. And I moved the other day in my doctor's office and he almost fell off his chair. So this sparked an idea. And I decided in my workshops from there on in, I would create little intention groups of 8 to 12, and see what happens. And what we would do, and this really came about because we were trying to see how we could show what intention does over a weekend. And you can't exactly manifest a car over a weekend or a new job. So I'd divide the people into 8 to 12 and have them send intention to each other. And amazing things happened. We would have somebody say with back problems, and person after person would report feeling better. The person with the back problems would feel better, or migraines. There was even a woman with an opacity in one eye. She could barely see out of it, reporting the next day it was 80% better. Now, I was really shocked by this because I hadn't thought of intention as this kind of instant healing force until my husband chanced upon some literature about the ancient Essenes. And he found that the Essenes were up to this all those thousands of years ago, as was Jesus before he was, Jesus, capital J. He was doing these kind of intention healing circles too. But the amazing thing about these intention healing circles is also this. It's not only the receivers of intention who feel better, but the senders themselves do. I had a workshop a few months ago in Kuwait, and one of the members of one group had an arthritic hip. And he felt better when he was sent intention, but so did one of the senders with an arthritic hip. I had a group of 4 people. One had back pain who was being sent intention and had problems in a right knee. She felt immediately better, but so did the 4 other people with back pain in the group, and one of the women who had problems with the right knee also felt tingling and then intensely better. So there is this kind of virtual circle in it. So there is this virtual circle in this intention sending. And I want to just look at this a minute and see what's going on. What we find is when there is this kind of philanthropic activity, a sense of intention powered by compassion, we quickly get on the same wavelength as the recipient. This has been demonstrated in a number of studies. And also, a connection occurs very easily between senders and receivers just after 5 minutes of holding each other's hands or sharing deeply about something that's important. This little group of 12 becomes a unit, a bond. And there is strong connection that happens quickly. And when people like this fire together, they begin to wire together. So extraordinary things happen in the group. We even have similar visualizations. I had one group once where a woman had a problem with her spine. She was being sent intention, and at least 5 members of her group of 12 had an identical visualization during the intention. They all imagined her spine coming out of her body and being sent white light. Now, what happens in these, if you ever want to run them yourselves with a group, is to get a group of 8 to 12. And to get them gathered together, we usually choose someone with a healing challenge. And that person is sent intention by the group after the group formulate an intention for that person. And I'd like to have them all formulate a common intention. Our intention is that John Doe be free of all back pain and be healthy and well in every way. I like to frame it positively. I always say it, my intention is that he be, or my intention that is that he already is free of back pain. And so you can do it either way. You take about 10 minutes, all holding a similar intention. I like everybody to hold hands in a circle, Or you can put the person who's the recipient of intention in the center of a circle and everybody put his or her hands on that person. But as long as it's a spoke, it's almost like the spokes of a wheel. But there needs to be, I believe, physical connection too. But that is the remarkable power of intention. We're all resonating as one. And there's probably a good reason for that, because when we talked about the idea that we are sending and receiving a tiny current of light at every moment, one of the things that's really important in relationships is thinking about what you're really sending. Because if you are sending out a tiny current of light, and we're all having two kinds of conversations with the people we connect with, not only the conversation we're having verbally, but also the conversation we're having with our light emissions. So if you're broadcasting, we think about intention as being a power thought, and that the universe, or indeed someone else, only hears it when we're deliberately sending out that intention. But actually, we're sending out and receiving at every moment. So the other 23 and a half hours of your day, your most secret desires and wishes, your judgments, your fears, your unconscious, your mind's endless chatter, the flotsam and jetsam in your mind, in fact, every single one of your casual thoughts, they also become your life's intention. So an important thing to think about with other people is what you're broadcasting, and whether you are broadcasting a positive or a negative thought. So considering that we're all leaky buckets, that we're all affecting each other at every moment, one of the things that you can do is to keep a relationship journal. And the purpose of this is to track your effect on your partner, your parent, your family, your dearest friends, and just detail times of emotional highs and lows, and make a note of any corresponding effects on your partner, his health or her health, his or her mood, mental and emotional state, and effectiveness in the world. And note any interesting correlations. When you're angry about something, is your partner clumsier than usual or less able to carry out tasks that are ordinarily easy? And also note how your good moods affect your partner. Does he or she suddenly become happier or more effective in the world? Monitor your movements, too. When you make negative hand gestures, just note any physical, mental, or emotional effects on your loved one, because we're so connected. We're even physically connected. So when you're making negative body language and you're sending that out, it's affecting your partner too, or your loved ones. Search for correlations between your positive and negative facial expressions. When you smile, what happens to your partner? What's your effect when you scowl? And examine the emotional state of the relationship when you are feeling at the top of your game and when you're feeling at the bottom of your game. Just look at when you're really feeling a high, what happens overall? And just take a note of it. And when you start tracking this, patterns emerge. So those are some ideas of how to create new relationships, how to make your role only in relation to another, and also about the hidden power of we, and how to make every encounter a meaningful connection that supports both of you. I hope you're going to use some of these tools to allow yourself to make deep connections with anyone, even those who disagree with everything you stand for. And use these kinds of communication skills also to engage differences in creative ways in order to produce greater shared understanding, possibility, and connection. So thank you for listening today.